Advent, as you may very well know, is the traditional beginning of the church year, which makes sense since if you follow the church year and all the different church liturgical seasons, it's all based around the story of Jesus, and Advent is the season in which we look forward to his birth, to his arrival, to his advent, which is just a word that means arrival. So in a sense, this is the new year, and it's a good time, being the new year, to think about beginnings. Beginnings are tricky. As I'm sure you know, there's only one chance to make a first impression, as they say, unhelpfully. Anyone who's ever begun a job interview knows that beginnings are tricky. Or if you've had to write a difficult letter, or if you've had to write a poem, or a sermon, or, to sort of deflect, a gospel. If you have to write a gospel, it's kind of tricky to know where to start. How would you start? Half the gospel writers start with John the Baptist. Duh. But the other half, Matthew and Luke, are the only gospel writers who choose to begin with what has become, for us, the Christmas story. 2 years ago, during Advent, we explored Matthew's beginning to his gospel. Last year, we looked at Luke's. That's all there is. So this year, we're back to Matthew. 2 years ago, when we looked at how Matthew chose to start his gospel, we focused on his choice to begin with a long genealogy. And at first, quite frankly, we found that didn't look like a very inspired choice. But then we discovered Matthew began his gospel with a very specific kind of genealogy that would have been really familiar to his original Jewish listeners. And we learned 2 years ago that the names of women were not supposed to appear in that very specific kind of genealogy. And suddenly things got interesting, because we learned that Matthew included the names of 4 ancient women in his genealogy when they weren't supposed to be there, to deliberately shock and even scandalize his original listeners. That's interesting. So we spent all of Advent 2 years ago exploring how and why Matthew did that. And if you missed all that first century scandal, it's still available on our website. And I know you have nothing else to do during this month. So there you go. Anyway, that was 2 years ago. This past fall, we've been exploring what we're calling the wisdom approach to the Bible. That is, thinking about how to make the difficult pivot from the Bible's original and ancient contexts, plural, to right now. From the sometimes diverse and ambiguous scriptures to our particular situations. And so at the beginning of this new year, in the church year, we're going to look once again at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, and we're going to see that Matthew himself is using the wisdom approach as he begins his gospel. He is, in fact, very creative as he looks at what were ancient scriptures to him and then pivots to his present situation. And his situation was trying to write the beginning of a gospel, trying to introduce Jesus and the importance of Jesus to listeners who had not met Jesus for themselves. And remember, the Gospel according to Matthew was a first century book written by a first century author to a first century audience. So our difficult task is to do what we can to recreate that original context, to get inside their heads, inside their culture, inside their worldview. And only then, I argue, only then can we perceive all the richness that Matthew so carefully and deliberately put in the beginning of his gospel. And that's what this is about. Getting out of his gospel's beginning all the richness that he put in. That's the point. So after all that, how does Matthew start his gospel? Well, with a sentence I'm not going to read to you yet. But that sentence just introduces the long, to us anyway, genealogy that we have to read through, or flip through, before we get to anything like a story. And that's what we usually do. We just flip through it and start the story. And you know the story. Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, and he's going to divorce her quietly, and the angel says, don't do that, and etc. As I said, 2 years ago, we focused on the 4 women that are named in that genealogy. Women who, quote unquote, shouldn't be there. Women who grabbed the attention of Matthew's original listeners. But this morning, I just want to point out that Matthew himself divides his genealogy into 3 parts. In fact, he's quite pleased with the numbers, how the numbers work out. But of course, that's only because he rigged it. But anyway, he writes, thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David. That's the first section. 14 generations from David to the exile in Babylon. And then the third section, 14 from the exile to the Messiah. 3 sections. Scholars sometimes label the sections this way. First, the patriarchs. Second, the kings. And third, the unknowns, or sometimes the nobodies. Bit brutal. In the first section, the patriarchs, that's where we find some of the great names in Israelite history. Names you know: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah, which people always, including me, when you hear this, you realize, oh yeah, that's where we get the word Judaism. It's from Judah. In the second section, the kings, we start with King David and King Solomon. Good start, strong start, but then it fades to all sorts of kings who were mostly not very faithful to the Israelite covenant and to the law, which is why that section ends in tragedy with the exile to Babylon. That's the kings. And the third section, the nobodies. And here we find, for the most part, names that mean nothing to anyone. Names that don't appear anywhere else in the Bible or in any other historical records. Names of people whose stories have been lost. Until we get to the very end of that section and we end up with Joseph and Mary and, of course, Jesus. Notice what Matthew is doing with that opening genealogy and with those 3 sections. He is actually explicitly retelling the story of Israel by name. This is the story of the Israelite nation. It began with the patriarchs, and then it moved into mature nationhood, complete with kings, and then it lost its way and dissolved, sometimes literally into nothingness, as first the Assyrian Empire and then the Babylonian Empire removed the Hebrew people from the Promised Land. Why is Matthew doing this? To proclaim, right off the bat, that the entire Israelite story leads to the arrival, to the advent of the Messiah. Interestingly to me, Matthew is the only gospel writer of the 4 to include a line you're probably very familiar with. Jesus saying, "Don't think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." You're probably familiar with that idea if you grew up in church. That's only in Matthew. And the point is that even in this opening genealogy, Matthew's already making this point. Jesus fulfills the entire Israelite story. The patriarchs led to the kings, led to the nothings, led to Jesus. And Matthew is by far the most Jewish-centric gospel. Matthew has the most references to what we call the Old Testament and what he called the Scriptures. Many times, Matthew explicitly mentions that Jesus fulfills various Old Testament scriptures. And unlike the other Gospels, Matthew doesn't explain Jewish customs. And scholars assume that's because he didn't have to. His originally intended listeners were primarily Jewish, and they already knew about the customs. It would be silly to explain. So with all of that Jewishness in mind, I will now go ahead and read you the very first sentence in Matthew. Here it is. It's not very exciting. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. In the Greek, it says literally, this is the genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And that, for his original listeners, would have called to mind the entire Israelite story. Right from Genesis, as that first book was already called then, from Genesis to Abraham to David to Jesus. All the big names, boom, very efficient, done. The entire Israelite story, Matthew is saying, finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Before we even get to any story, Matthew is making that proclamation. Okay, if you could all just in your imaginations now be those two old Muppets up in the balcony. Maybe you always are, but just let it out. And nice. Yeah, agreed. At this point, you might say, yeah, almost the entire Israelite story. Matthew has almost got the whole story, but there's something missing, something critical, something far too massive to leave out. If you were one of those two grumpy men in the balcony, you would say, Matthew has failed to tell the entire Israelite story. What's missing? We might call up to those Muppets, and those old men would call back, what's missing? Well, only, arguably, the most important leader in Israelite history. That's all. Only, arguably, the most important event in Israelite history. Only the event commemorated each year by one of the most important Jewish holidays. We're talking about Moses. We're talking about the Exodus, the escape from Egyptian slavery. We're talking about the iconic moment in Israelite history that most perfectly captures the saving action of God, the moment that's referred to in psalm after psalm as they try to remember how God is faithful and loyal. We're talking about the Passover. That's all Matthew seems to have left out. Just that. If, we might say, grumpily, if Matthew really is trying to start his gospel with the entire story of Israel, why would he leave that out? And that's where things start to get fun. This is where Matthew gets all artsy. Moses was not in the genealogy of Jesus, so Matthew just couldn't mention Moses then. Wasn't in the ancestry. Couldn't mention Moses or the Exodus there. But Matthew finds other ways, and it's really fun to me how sneaky Matthew is about this. So here we go. This is the sermon. Me enjoying Matthew's sneakiness. You having to listen. Or not really having to. I mean, just you can drift. So we'll start our investigation into the missing Exodus, into the missing Moses, with a kind of strange question that we will ask of both Matthew and Luke, again, the only two Gospels who have the Christmas story. And they both, Matthew and Luke, include a genealogy. Luke just, has the savvy not to start with a genealogy. He gets you attention first and then bores you with a genealogy. So let's ask Matthew and Luke this really, really exciting question. Who was the legal paternal grandfather of Jesus? And as it turns out, Matthew and Luke give different answers. They have different names in their genealogies. I've mentioned this before as an example this fall when we've been exploring how the Bible is ancient, ambiguous, and diverse. And the point has been that the ancient genealogies don't play by the same rules that our genealogies do. They could skip generations if they wanted to. They could rearrange the order of the names if they wanted to. They had a flexibility we don't have. Because for us, genealogies are about listing all the names in precise chronological order. But for them, a genealogy was there to tell a story. A genealogy was there to make a point. So, Matthew and Luke, who was the legal paternal grandfather of Jesus? And Luke answers Heli, while Matthew answers Jacob. At this point, I feel like I am channeling my inner Uncle Brian. Uncle Brian was the one in my extended family who took over every family reunion with information like this. We would all have to gather in some godforsaken huge room, and there'd be a slideshow, like a real slideshow with the fan going so loudly that you couldn't hear anything. And Uncle Brian would have, about 100 slides. And the whole point when he got to the end was that great-great-great-great-aunt Matilda's sister was, it turns out, married at age 18 and not 19 as previously thought. Those of us who had not sneaked out during the presentation were left thinking, this is what we waited for. We stuck around for that. I feel like I just did that to you. Luke says, Heli, and Matthew says, Jacob. Now I'm going to try to make the case why this is important. Matthew, remember, had a choice. Had a choice because of the flexibility of ancient genealogies. And for Matthew, making the choice to say Jacob meant that his original first century Jewish listeners would have heard this phrase at the end of the opening genealogy. Are you ready? Here's what they would have heard. And it's what we read. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, who was the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And nothing may have struck you as very interesting there, but the key here is the phrase, Jacob, the father of Joseph. Remember, yet again, Matthew was writing for listeners, not readers. And we've seen already that Matthew was writing for primarily Jewish listeners who were saturated in the stories of the scriptures, the stories of the Old Testament, their stories. So for those listeners, ask yourself, is there anything familiar in this phrase? Jacob, the father of Joseph. Oh. Always the keen students sit in the front. And of course there is something familiar in that phrase. And that phrase, and this would have been out of their control, would have taken Matthew's listeners right back to one of the most well-known stories in their history, where ancient Jacob was the father of ancient Joseph. And you know who I mean. Joseph, the favorite son with the fancy coat, who dreamed dreams. Joseph the dreamer, who, not really by choice, ended up in Egypt. Joseph, who ended up in Egypt and as a result saved his family. You know the story. Even today, it's one of the Bible's greatest hits. The power of words. With one small phrase, Jacob, the father of Joseph, Matthew took his original Jewish listeners back to ancient times, back to Egypt, which of course led them right up to the ancient Egyptian slavery that was also a major part of their past, and perhaps even subconsciously, or not, they would have thought about the end of that slavery where the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, tried to kill all the Hebrew baby boys with the law that they had to be thrown into the Nile River, where the life of one Hebrew baby boy was saved, Moses, floating in a baby-sized boat in the Nile River. Moses, a boy who grew up to lead God's people out of Egyptian slavery and back right to the border of the Promised Land. The next leader, Joshua, would be the leader to actually go into the Promised Land and help them settle in and live out the covenant they had just received at Mount Sinai. And by the way, just so you know, the name Joshua means the Lord saves. Wow, you might say, skeptically. All of that, really? All of that from the phrase Jacob, the father of Joseph? And I say, yeah, maybe. But I remind you, they were immersed in these stories. They heard them over and over and over, these ancient stories. The stories were, in a very real sense, their identity. Their religious identity, their national identity was found in their stories. So yes, I think the phrase Jacob, the father of Joseph, would have done a lot. And by the way, I think, it makes it sound like, ooh, I discovered this. No, I read this in a lot of the commentaries and things like this. So I'm not making stuff up here. I'm reporting back to you what I have learned. If I started a story with the phrase, and I could disguise it a little, Mary, the mother of Jesus, you'd probably think of the Christmas story, just by instinct. If I said Mary, the mother of Jesus, for sure you would. Okay. I wonder if any of those things I just listed about the ancient Joseph and the ancient Egyptian situation and the ancient Pharaoh, I wonder if any of that is sounding familiar to you, considering what comes next in Matthew's Gospel. We know what comes next in Matthew's Gospel since we've probably read it or heard it before. But I want you to imagine being one of those original listeners, being introduced to the person of Jesus for the first time, hearing this gospel for the first time, and you would have heard all of it in one long sitting as the token literate person read it aloud to you. Imagine the dawning realization after you've heard Jacob, the father of Joseph, and been taken back. Imagine the dawning realization as you keep listening, as Matthew pivots from that ancient reference to the modern day Joseph, the son of Jacob. Imagine the dawning realization as you listen to how this modern day Joseph dreams dreams. In one of them, he's told to stick with Mary and the coming baby boy. He's also told to name that boy. And are you ready for the name? Here is the name. Joshua. Maybe you know this, but Jesus is just the Greekified version of Joshua. For some reason, it never, in common usage, reverted back. Why name him Joshua? Because, the angel says in the dream, to the modern day Joseph, because he will save his people. The Lord saves. Imagine the dawning realization, if you were that first century listener, as Matthew keeps going and you hear the story of a king who's trying to kill all the Hebrew baby boys. The king is King Herod this time, not Pharaoh. Imagine the dawning realization as you hear how the modern day Joseph dreams again and, not really by his choice, takes his family to Egypt to keep them safe. You ever notice that weird part of the Matthew story? Doesn't appear in Luke. And later, once the marauding King Herod is no longer alive, the modern day Joseph the dreamer receives the message that it's safe to go home again with these words, "For those wanting to kill the child are dead," which is almost word for word the same message Moses received in ancient times from God. For those wanting to kill you are dead. It's a deliberate echo. So the modern day Joseph takes his family back out of Egypt, and the modern day Joshua, that's Jesus, arrives in the promised land as the eventual leader of God's people for a whole new era under a whole new covenant. I just want to summarize what's happened here. Matthew is, on purpose, evoking and describing as a kind of double exposure, encouraging his Jewish listeners to hear both things at once, the ancient stories and this new modern day story, a double exposure. And the following elements are in both ancient history and his modern time. A Joseph who dreams dreams, a family of Joseph that goes down to Egypt to avoid danger, a king that tries to kill Hebrew baby boys, a family of Joseph that returns from Egypt to the promised land, and a Joshua who will save his people, leading them to a new promise and a new covenant. None of that is accidental. Matthew is very creatively and very deliberately evoking all of the most important parts of the Israelite story. Again, why? Because that story is the Genesis, the beginning of the story of Jesus the Messiah. If I could paraphrase, Matthew is basically saying, listen up, people. The story I'm about to tell you, the story that hasn't even started yet, about Jesus, the Messiah, is, like the story of Moses and the Exodus and Joshua, this story is a life-changing, era-changing story about the God who saves, about the God who heals. And in Jesus, the modern-day Joshua, all those other stories, all the law and the prophets, find their fulfillment. Now, Matthew's original first-century Jewish listeners didn't miss that. It was obvious. It was loud and clear to them. And this is where we have to do work, because we 21st century people don't have those same instincts. So we have to do a bit of work to get inside their first-century heads, inside their culture, inside their worldview, and only then, as I said, can we perceive all the richness that Matthew so deliberately put in there. Please remember, Matthew and Luke did not include what are called the infancy narratives about Jesus in their Gospels so that eventually the Christian subculture could have a lot of really cute picture books. That is not the purpose. The picture books are nice, of course, but that's not really what the infancy narratives are about. It's not what they're for. Remember that they were written by grown-ups for grown-ups about grown-up issues. In Matthew's case, he was directly addressing the more Jewish side of the first century church. A church, by the way, that was in danger of splitting along Jewish and Gentile lines. 2 years ago, studying those 4 women who quote-unquote shouldn't be in that opening genealogy, we saw that Matthew's message to that first century Jewish Christian element was that God is a God of inclusion. 3 of those 4 women were Gentiles, and the 4th might have been because she was married to one. One of those women was a prostitute. One dressed up like a prostitute to get pregnant. One committed adultery with King David, and one lay down provocatively next to a drunk man in the middle of the night to propose marriage to him. That's not cute picture book material. But the by grown-ups, for grown-ups message was crucial. In God's eyes, the so-called dirty outsider has always been part of the story. Part of the story of the people of God. We exclude, in part because it's easier and tidier. But God doesn't seem to mind the messiness and the complication that comes with inclusion. As some people say, God writes the story with crooked lines. All of us. That's 2 years ago. This morning we looked at another of Matthew's by grown-ups, for grown-ups themes. And again, it's aimed at the more Jewish side of the first century church. And this time, it's a very serious theological statement through that double exposure, a very serious statement about what it means that Jesus is the Messiah. So when we read the Gospel of Matthew, or if we were in the first century, when we were hearing it, before we even get to John the Baptist, because Matthew gets there too, before we get to the adult Jesus, before the ministry and the teaching and the parables and the betrayal and the suffering and the death and the resurrection, before all of that, by evoking the entire story of Israel, including the Exodus and Moses and the ancient Joseph, by evoking all of that as a mere prelude to the story of Jesus, Matthew wants his listeners to understand something crucial. It's this. This story changes everything. That's not cute picture book material. It's unsettling. Changing everything? That's unsettling, by definition. And it's unsettling in a lot of good ways, too. The proud will be humbled. The weak will be lifted up. The hungry will be fed. The so-called dirty outsider will be welcomed into the banquet hall with arms wide open. And that, of course, is the real and true source of the peace that we celebrate on this second Sunday of Advent. So thanks be to God for the art, the literary art of Matthew's writing that helps us, once we get into that context, see that deep truth about God just a little bit more clearly than we might have seen it before on this second Sunday of Advent. Amen.